Section 1 of 4 Science Fiction Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kirk Ziegler, Lake Placid, Florida. 4 Science Stories by Alan E. Nourse. Bear Trap, Part 1. The huge transport plane eased down through the rainy drizzle enshrouding New York International Airport about 5 o'clock in the evening. Tom Shandor glanced sourly through the port at the wet landing strip, saw the dim landing lights reflected in the steaming puddles. On an adjacent field he could see the rows and rows of jet fighters, wings up in the foggy rain, poised like ridiculous birds in the darkness. With a sigh he ripped the sheet of paper from the small, battered portable typewriter on his laptop and zipped the machine up in its slicker case. Across the troop hold the soldiers were beginning to stir, yawning, shifting their packs, collecting their gear. Occasionally they stared at Shandor as if he were totally alien to their midst, and he shivered a little as he collected the sheets of paper scattered on the deck around him, checked the date, 27 September 1982, and rolled them up to fit in the slim round mailing container. 10 minutes later he was shouldering his way through the crowd of khaki-clad men, scowling up at the sky, his nondescript fedora jammed down over his eyes to keep out the rain, slicker collar pulled up about his ears. At the gangway he stopped before a tired-looking lieutenant and flashed the small fluorescent card in his palm. Public Information Board. The officer nodded wearily and gave his coat and typewriter a cursory check, then motioned him on. He strode across the wet field, scowling at the fog, toward the dimmed-out waiting rooms. He found a mailing chute and popped the mailing tube down the slot as if he were glad to be rid of it. Into the speaker he said, "Special delivery, PIB business. It goes to press tonight." The female voice from the speaker said something, and the red clear signal blinked. Shandor slipped off his hat and shook it, then stopped at a coffee machine and extracted a cup of steaming stuff from the bottom after trying the coin 3 times. Finally he walked across the room to an empty video booth, and sat down into the chair with an exhausted sigh. Flipping a switch he waited several minutes for an operator to appear. He gave her a number and then said, "Let's scramble it, please." "Official?" He showed her the card and settled back, his whole body tired. He was a tall man, rather slender, with flat, bland features punctuated only by blond carrot-shaped eyebrows. His gray eyes were heavy-lidded now, his mouth an expressionless line as he waited, sunk back into his coat with a long-cultivated air of lifeless boredom. He watched the screen without interest as it bleeped a time or two, then shifted into the familiar scrambled image pattern. After a moment he muttered the Public Information Board audio code words, and saw the screen even out into the clear image of a large, heavy-set man at a desk. "Hart," said Shandor. "Story's on its way. I just dropped it from the airport a minute ago, with a rush tag on it. You should have it for the morning editions." The big man in the screen blinked, and his heavy face lit up. "The story on the rocket project?" Shandor nodded. "The whole scoop. I'm going home now." He started his hand for the cut-off switch. "Wait a minute." Hart picked up a pencil and fiddled with it for a moment. He glanced over his shoulder, and his voice dropped a little. "Is the line scrambled?" Shandor nodded. "What's the scoop, boy? How's the rocket project coming?" Shandor grinned wryly. "Read the report, Daddy. Everything's just ducky. Of course it's all ready for press. You've got the story. Why should I repeat it?" Hart scowled impatiently. No, I mean the scoop. The real stuff. How's the project going?" "Not so hot." Shandor's face was weary. "Material cutoff is holding them up something awful. Among other things, the sabotage has really fouled up the West Coast trains, and shipments haven't been coming through on schedule. You know, they ask for one thing, and get the wrong weight, or their supplier is out of material, or something goes wrong. And there's personnel trouble, too. Too much direction and too little work. It's beginning to look as if they'll never get going. And now it looks like there's going to be another administration shakeup, and you know what that means." Hart nodded thoughtfully. "They'd better get hopping," he muttered. "The conference in Berlin is on the skids. It could be hours now." He looked up. "But you got the story rigged all right?" Shander's face flattened in distaste. Sure. You know me, Hart. Anything to keep the people happy. Everything's running as smooth as satin. Work going fine, except a test run in a month and we should be on the moon in half a year, more or less, maybe. We hope the usual swill. I'll be in to work out the war stories in the morning. Right now I'm for bed." He snapped off the video before Hart could interrupt and started for the door. The rain hit him as he stepped out, with a wave of cold, wet depression, but a cab slid up to the curb before him and he stepped in. Sinking back, he tried to relax, to get his stomach to stop complaining, but he couldn't fight the feeling of almost physical illness sweeping over him. He closed his eyes and sank back, trying to drive the ever-plaguing thoughts from his mind, trying to focus on something pleasant, almost hoping that his long-starved conscience might give a final grasp or two and die altogether. But deep in his mind he knew that his screaming conscience was almost the only thing that held him together. Lies, he thought to himself bitterly. White lies, black lies, whoppers, you could take your choice. There should be a flaming neon sign flashing across the sky, telling all people, Public Information Board, Fabrication Corporation, fabricating of all lies neatly and expeditiously done. He squirmed, feeling the rebellion grow in his mind. Propaganda, they called it. A nice word, such a very handy word, covering a multitude of seething pots. PIB was the Grand Clearing House, the last censor of censors, and he, Tom Shandor, was the chief fabricator and purveyor of lies. He shook his head, trying to get a breath of clean air in the damp cab. Sometimes he wondered where it was leading, where it would finally end up, and what would happen if the people ever really learned, or ever listened to the clever ones who tried to sneak the truth into print somewhere. But people couldn't be told the truth. They had to be coddled, urged, pushed along. They had to be kept somehow happy, somehow hopeful. They had to be kept whipped up to fever pitch, because the long years of war and near war had exhausted them, wearied them beyond natural resiliency. No, they had to be spiked, urged, and goaded. What would happen if they learned? He sighed. No one, it seemed, could do it as well as he. No one could take a story of bitter diplomatic fighting in Berlin and simmer it down to a public, palatable, peaceful, and progressive meeting. No one could quite so skillfully reduce the bloody fighting in India to a mild enemy loss topping American losses 20-1. And our boys are fighting staunchly, bravely. No one could write out the lies quite so neatly, so smoothly as Tom Shandor. The cab swung into his house and he stepped out, tipped the driver, and walked up the walk, eager for the warm, dry room. Coffee helped sometimes when he felt this way, but other things helped even more. He didn't even take his coat off before mixing and drowning a stiff rye and ginger, and he was almost forgetting his unhappy conscience by the time the video began blinking. He flipped the receiver switch and sat down groggily, blinked at John Hart's heavy face as it materialized on the screen. Hart's eyes were wide, his voice tight and nervous as he leaned forward. "You better get into the office pronto," he said, his eyes bright. "You've really got a story to work on now." Shandor blinked. "The war?" Hart took a deep breath. "Worse," he said. "David Ingersoll is dead." Tom Shandor shouldered his way through the crowd of men in the anteroom and went into the inner office. Closing the door behind him coolly, he faced the man at the desk and threw a thumb over his shoulder. "Who's the goons?" he growled. "You haven't released a story yet?" John Hart sighed, his pinkish face drawn. The press. I don't know how they got the word. There hasn't been a word released, but. He shrugged and motioned Shandor to have a seat. You know how it goes. Shandor sat down, his face blank, eyeing the information chief woodenly. The room was silent for a moment, a tense anticipatory silence. Then Hart said, "The rocket story was great, Tommy, a real writing job. You've got the touch when it comes to a ticklish news release." Shandor allowed an expression of distaste to cross his face. He looked at the chubby man across the desk and felt the distaste deepen and crystallize. John Hart's face was round, with little lines going up from the eyes. An almost grotesque, burlesque comic face that belied the icy practical nature of the man behind it. A thoroughly distasteful face, Shandor thought. Finally he said, "The story, John, on Ingersoll. Let's have it, straight out." Hart shrugged his stocky shoulders, spreading his hands. "Ingersoll's dead," he said. "That's all there is to it. He's stone cold dead." "But he can't be dead," roared Shandor, his face flushed. "We just can't afford to have him dead." Hart looked up wearily. "Look, I didn't kill him. He went home from the White House this evening, apparently sound enough, after a long, stiff, nasty conference with the president. Ingersoll wanted to go to Berlin and call a showdown at the international conference there, and he had a policy brawl with the president, and the president wouldn't let him go, sent an undersecretary instead, and threatened to kick Ingersoll out of the cabinet unless he quieted down. Ingersoll got home at 4:30, collapsed at 5, and he was dead before the doctor arrived. Cerebral hemorrhage, pretty straightforward. Ingersoll's been killing himself for years. He knew it, and everyone else in Washington knew it. It was bound to happen sooner or later." "He was trying to prevent a war," said Shandor dully. "And he was all by himself. Nobody else wanted to stop it. Nobody that mattered, at any rate. Only the people didn't want war, and whoever listens to them? Ingersoll got the people behind him, so they gave him a couple of Nobel Peace Prizes and made him Secretary of State, and then cut his throat every time he tried to do anything. No wonder he's dead." Hart shrugged again, eloquently indifferent. "So he was a nice guy. He wanted to prevent a war. As far as I'm concerned, he was a pain in the neck, the way he was forever jumping down information's throat. But he's dead now. He isn't around any more." His eyes narrowed sharply. "The important thing, Tommy, is that the people won't like it that he's dead. They trusted him. He's been the people's golden boy, their last-ditch hope for peace. If they think their last chance is gone with his death, they're going to be mad. They won't like it, and there'll be hell to pay." Shandor lit a smoke with trembling fingers, his eyes smoldering. "So the people have to be eased out of the picture," he said flatly. "They've got to get the story so they won't be so angry." Hart nodded, grinning. "We've got to have a real story, Tommy. Big, blown up. What a great guy he was. Defender of the peace. Greatest, most influential man in America has turned out since the half-century. You know what they lap up, the usual garbage, only on a slightly higher plane. They've got to think that he's really saved them, that he's turned over the reins to other hands just as worthy as his. You can give the president a big hand there. They've got to think his work is the basis of our present foreign policy. Can't you see the implications? It's got to be spread on with a trowel, laid on skillfully." Shandor's face flushed deep red, and he ground the stub of his smoke out viciously. "I'm sick of this stuff, Hart," he exploded. "I'm sick of you. I'm sick of this whole rotten setup. This business of writing reams and reams of lies to just keep things under control. Ingersoll was a great man, a really great man, and he was wasted, thrown away. He worked to make peace, and he got laughed at. He hasn't done a thing, because he couldn't. Everything he has tried has been useless, wasted. That's the truth. Why not tell that to the people?" Hart stared.